Okay. We're going to continue with our. This is going to be a demonstration on mark making, particularly, and edges. Okay. So I can get this thing in focus. So being that we're about to start with some landscapes, and this is given to you if you came to the supply pickup. I'm going to post this onto the Canvas page. This will be your first um, practice in actually trying to paint landscapes or landscape parts rather. So what I have represented here is clouds, patches of a forest like the woods, the trunks and the branches, some other type of foliage, um, just tree shapes. Then with some of the foliage on that as well, different, just a variety. And then we have here rock. I don't think it's the best image of rock necessarily, and I may replace that one, but we'll see. So basically, what I always keep saying what represents landscapes more than anything is texture. If you can capture the value, which we've been working on, and the texture, and also the edges, then you will be fairly successful in creating a landscape. What do I mean by when I talk about edges? Particularly like in the cloud here, you can kind of see what I would define as being a hard edge, one that's fairly crisp and defined, whereas a soft edge would be one such as right here, which is on, still part of that same cloud, but as it comes over this side, it starts to get kind of soft, almost lost, but definitely soft, not as hard as that one. So we're going to talk about hard and soft edges. If you look throughout this image, um, there are fairly some soft and then on the verge of being hard edges in other places, and then definitely soft and almost lost, such as in that place. One other thing I forgot, water. So, all right, so flip this over. So water is our other element for our riverscape. Um, and the other thing to discuss really is texture. When we look at the texture of water versus the texture of, say, this foliage, it's definitely a lot different. And just how you represent that texture. Um, and typically, when you're trying to paint a landscape, no artist out there really is trying to represent uh, each blade of grass they see, each leaf on a tree they see. So they're just trying to create something that's similar and like it. So if you can do that, then you're doing fine. It may still look somewhat like paint and brush marks, but if it starts to describe and start to look like things we recognize, such as foliage in trees or grass or ripples in water, then you've done all that I would require that you do. If you create something similar to that and it describes it and it can pass as water or trees or grass or rock or clouds. So that's what we're going to be focused on today, is exploring how to make marks and how to go about creating these textures and edges. Okay, so what I have here is the things I'm going to need. Again, the paint, still a bit dirty from last class, my last demonstration. So this paint's still wet. I didn't put out a lot, and start to see it start to kind of dry around the edge right there. It's not as shiny as such as right there. When you get right there, it's a little duller So it's getting a little dry. All this is dry. So I can just really mix right on top of this. Maybe I wouldn't want to mix a white on top of this because, like I said, tempera will re-wet. So, but if I got a gray like this and I want to mix on top of that, I may end up some of that getting into my mixture. So tempera can re-wet. So maybe I'll just kind of demonstrate that real quick. So if I just take this clean brush, dip it in some water, spread it around right there, start to see, now I got some gray on my brush. So it's kind of like watercolor in that way. Sometimes you get things called tempera cakes. There's sort of a dried cake of tempera, and you just apply water to it and it re-wets. So, alright, so you don't have to have a clean plate, in other words. Some students would prefer to have a clean plate, and that's why you kind of got the other plate as well, the lid. So you could use this as your clean mixing area, or just continue to mix on top of this, which would be fine, which I'll probably do. So, got my paints. As far as brushes go for today, this is where you're going to need your rounds. These are the pointed brushes. And I just grabbed a variety of those. Let me get this one out. Now, it'd be good in certain instances where you can get a very nice fine point on one of these rounds. Not all rounds really are very fine pointed sometimes, such as this one. This one's getting kind of blunt right there, but sometimes you want a good point. It could even be a bigger brush like that, and that's still got a really fine, sharp point to it that we could use, which I'll demonstrate in a minute. It doesn't have to be something super fine and narrow, such as this one. This wouldn't hold much paint, but still you can get some fine marks with it. So I have a variety of different ones. And generally, when brushes get wet, I'll point this out. Since this one doesn't look very pointed, let's see what it does when I wet it. So sometimes when you wet these things, they might not look very pointed at first, but you wet them, they'll kind of get to a sharper point. They'll just kind of gather together. So even though they may not look very sharp at the moment, such as this one. This one, when it was dry, did not look very sharp at first. So if I dry this off, so sometimes paint will gather the brush together. So this is still kind of moist, but it was fairly fanned out. So let me show you these brushes. Now, these two are rounds, but they're old. As you can see, some of the paint that's on it and so forth, kind of worn. And these were once probably as pointed as these, but just over time these bristles start to kind of fan out. They're clean, they've been cleaned well, but they just kind of start to fan out. And they start to lose their pointedness. So these have their place though, and so I'll demonstrate where these can really shine. Also, that can be the same case for flats. This is an older flat. You can kind of see it's worn, but the type of mark that would make can be pretty unique and helpful. And sometimes, looks like this is about to come off. This will sometimes happen to brushes. The ferrule, where it's crimped onto the wooden handle. It will kind of come off. So you can see right there where the marks where they crimp it. So all you have to do is kind of grab it and push, kind of twist a little bit, and just jam it back in there, and you're good to go again. Alright, so let's push it out of the way. I did get a bigger cup of water this time rather than my little cup. Just be on the safe side, that way I can swish it around, not worry about tipping over or sloshing out over the sides. And I got my paper towel. I got my piece of paper from last demonstration. I'm going to need a pencil. So I'm going to divide this page up some so that we can do what it is we're going to demonstrate. So I'm going to make two rectangles side by side. Well, basically a big square, and then make two rectangles out of it. So I'll demonstrate. I'm going to keep it about the same size as what my value scale was. So I'm just going to bring this line down. Maybe not quite make a square. So it is a rectangle. And I'll divide it in the middle. Okay. For this one, it's going to be basically mark making. So let's just label this down here, mark making. Okay, and the type of marks we're going to explore are basically like specks, dashes, lines, and we'll explore that. Okay, but also the type of paint we're going to be working with is some of it's going to be fluid, basically, versus dry. Okay. All right. Other things we're going to be experimenting with. I'm going to draw another rectangle right here. So you can judge by the size. I'm going to need to section this off basically 4 times. So I'm going to stop it here and section it in the middle. I'm going to section it again. Okay. And with this is going to be different, creating a texture and showing you sort of the bad versus the good. Okay. So let's just label this bad, good, and then let's put here same size. And we'll put here same size. And we'll put here varied size. And then varied size. Okay. And down here we're going to, when we make our marks, we're just labeling all this to begin with. So this is rows and columns. Okay. So this is varied space. This is varied space. And this will be multi-layer, multi-value. So again, describing that and doing that one. The other thing we're going to need to do, we're going to use this space. So I'm going to create a long horizontal rectangle. I'm going to divide this one up 6 times. Okay. Now this one has to do with texture. Okay. This one has to do with mark making. No, sorry. This was mark making. This is going to be edges. Okay. So for this, I'm going to pretty much divide it down the middle. Okay. And then what I'm going to do for this is label this one as well. This is going to be hard. This is going to be soft, smooth. This is going to be soft, rough. This is going to be lost, smooth. This is going to be lost, rough. Actually, lost, rough, speckle. This is going to be lost, rough, dash. Okay. All right. And that's what we got cut out for us today to do. Okay. So, all right. So let me see if I can bring this in a little closer. Okay. All right. So this first one, we're going to create sort of a light area and then a dark area. And you can just use your rounds for this, like a big round would cover very well. You can also just go ahead and grab one of your flats like we used last time, since we're just going to cover this area in. So I'm going to create sort of a really dark gray. So it's going to be mostly black with just a little bit of white in it. White's dry right there. So just going to mix that in. Now, if these paints are getting fairly kind of thick on you, you can potentially add just a touch of water. So if I just barely put a little bit of water on my brush, not to soak it, and then kind of work that into my paint, it'll become much more fluid on you. So I'm just trying to revive my paint a little bit because it has gotten a little thick on me. Out towards the edges where the paint's going to dry quickest because it's thinner. Alright. So probably not going to be enough here. Actually, I can add a little bit of water to that. Maybe it'll spread better. There we go. So if you want to spread a bigger area, sometimes add water to the paint, which we'll do when we tone our paper. Add quite a bit of water to the paint, just so it spreads over the entire area. It being so thick, without having water in it, we'd have a hard time covering the entire area. Now, if you put a lot of water in it, it will thin to the point that it becomes fairly transparent. This is doing pretty good. Still fairly opaque. just with the paint really dry, it just doesn't want to spread, which we're getting ready to get into with this demonstration. Okay, so now I want to make a lighter value up here. So let me see if I can take some of that paint off of my palette right there. So I just got this really dark residue left in my brush. Let me just scoop up a lot of white, bring it over here, mix that in. Pigment's really coming out of the brush there at dark. I'm going to get some of that paint off the brush. I will add a little bit of water, just a part of it right here. Thin that down to where then I can spread it in this area. You'll see what I mean. Trying to spread thick paint over that area to take a lot more paint than as if you just took it and thinned it down. You'll find it'll cover a lot better when it's thinned down with water. Don't worry about staying within the lines. It's just a demonstration. Alright, so this dries, you know, we know by now this dries really quick. You can already see it right there getting a little lighter in some areas. I will go ahead, I believe, and go ahead and paint in some of these other areas just because when we demonstrate on top of that. So I think I'm going to take this value that we created right here and put in these areas. Got a little dark on me right there, so I think I'm just going to work with this over here so make it a little lighter. Just more and more black keeps coming out of that brush. So I'm going to add some water to it, maybe just over on the side right here. If I have water to all that, that would be maybe a little more than I need. You can see how that's really lightening up right now. And just see how kind of liquidy that's getting. It's almost run. Almost wants to run. Okay. So we're basically going to do about the same thing up here. Now remember, you know, we talk about toning the ground. That's sort of what we're doing. We're prepping areas that which we're going to make marks on. So still want to try to go even a little lighter on this, I think. I'm going to grab even more white. I'm going to mix it in with all of it. I keep trying to make a lighter version, so just with that little bit of darkness on my brush, it keeps coming off on it and keeps making it dark. Well, just not as light as I would like. I think that's going to be good. Add more white just because I think I'm going to need more paint. Okay, that looks pretty good. So I'm going to add a little bit of water to just at the edge of it right here. Kind of a watery version of it. I'm just going to do up in the upper portions. Actually, I'm going to touch this line right here. Notice I'm leaving a little bit of an edge right there, a border or a margin. But I am touching the line on this one. Add a little more water. Otherwise, I could have painted all the way across, but I do want to maintain the separation. But here I will touch the line there. Okay. So now I'm going to put in a dark value down along the bottom of this one, basically about like I did here. So I know that might be too light to put in there. We'll see what happens. Still might maintain being pretty dark. So mix that in. Without cleaning my brush. I think that's going to give me a really good dark value. Make it a little darker and need more paint anyway. I think that'd be enough. Once I add water to it. I think that'll be enough to cover all of these. So painting right up to the other value here. So as long as it's a dark value gray, doesn't, as long as it's not black, and then a white value gray, as long as it's not white, that'll work. And as long as you're painting right up to the edge of each other through here, leaving a separation between different areas. Okay. So we've completed all of our grounds for all the test areas that we're going to do for our demonstration today, okay? So once you got to that, you're pretty much set, okay? All right, so from here, I don't need my flat brush anymore. I can rinse it off or Just set it in my water for now. Just kind of set it in there. Now is where I'm going to need a pointed brush. Now I could, I think I'm going to go with this one. And that's a pretty good pointed brush, okay? Now, as I was talking about with the different, this is going to be the mark making. And so with this one, we're going to talk about is if it was fluid versus if it was dry. And then specks, dashes, and lines, okay? So without it being fluid or dry, remember I was talking about, you know, this paint being fairly dry, right? I mean, thick, sorry. If it was, especially if it's sat here, you know, this is getting kind of thick at the edges. So getting thicker, right? So, so if I take a little bit of that paint right at the edge, and I try to create like a line with it, I probably won't get that far, and I probably got to press down fairly hard with it. As you can see there, now to get any more paint out of the brush, I got to really kind of press down on it. Okay, so that's just the paint as it is, and that's pretty good because that's a thin brush anyway. But if you had a thicker brush like this and you tried to make a thin line, you potentially could. So let me just try with this brush. So the point on it's not very pointed right now. I could even go ahead and try to wet that a little bit and get a little bit of moisture in it to get it down to a kind of a point, and then put it into the paint just as the paint is, and try to make a line with it, a thin line. I can still make a fairly good thin line. It's fairly decent, right? Even though this brush is a bit bigger than that, right? Now, watch what happens. And that does have a nice quality of kind of variation in the line. So that's a nice line quality in that. But if we did, or we added water to it, just as we did with the other paint. So if I took a little bit of white, place it right here on my plate, dip my brush into the water, and added water to that. Okay, it's going to get fairly thin. But watch what happens now. Look at that brush, how pointed it's gotten now. And also look at the line I can create with that. Okay, it's very, looks a little, maybe it did kind of thin out a little bit. But when you add water to paint, you can really stretch out the paint. In other words, you can just get more paint out of the brush. Now it's getting a little thick on me in terms of the width of the line. So I'm going to switch brushes here. Add a little more paint to that. Add a little bit of water to that. Look at that. So now it didn't get so thin that I had to add so much water to it that it started getting kind of pale on me. Whereas, you know, I still had, you know, added water to it, so it still maintains some of the white pigment in it. But just being fluid, I'm able to make these really nice fluid lines. Really stretch them out. So if you're ever having issues making a thin line, add some water to the paint, okay? If you add water to the paint, you can make really fine lines, okay? So this kind of gets us over into some of the dashes, which is kind of like what that is. So we got a line, and then we got a dash, like small little lines. And those can really come in handy. Making little dashes like that, okay? So, um, as far as now dry, okay, let's talk about dry. About to run out of space here. So with dry, um, what we want to do is actually dry the paint, okay, off the brush to a certain degree. So I'm going to switch brushes for this. I'm going to actually go back to this one. I'm just going to wipe it to get any of the moisture out of it, okay. All right. So now you can see it's not really down to a point anymore. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take some white paint and not put much on the brush, just a little bit. Now this is a technique where it's called a dry brush, or sometimes it's called scumbling, okay? Where you kind of lay the brush down. It's not straight up like we were. That's an important thing I forgot to mention here. If you notice when I was making these, I have a brush straight up and down. And what that does is that focuses everything just on that point. Because I don't want to touch any of the sides. If I lay it down like this, the brush will start to spread and I'll start to get a wider mark, okay? So having it straight up causes you to just focus on just using the point of the brush, okay? This one I'm going to lay down its side because I do want to use the side of the brush. So with this, if you notice what's going to happen is we start to get a mark like that. That is called dry brush, okay? And that texture and that mark really comes in handy as far as making marks, a variety of type of mark which you can make. So again, I can make sort of a little dash. Really did, I really was sparingly on the, so you gotta keep constantly kind of add a little paint to it, and it's kind of hard to control sometimes because it might end up not putting down more than you want, as enough that you wanted, or it might end up putting more than you wanted. So it really is like there's a trace amount of paint left on the brush and you're just applying it. So you can make little dashes, little specks. And that's why I consider sort of a speck. Now you could also make a very fine pointed speck, of course, as well. You may know of this as called stippling, right? Where you just put down a bunch of dots, kind of run out of room here. Stippling is where it's usually dark on light paper. This type of ink type, like drawing technique used a lot. So there's a variety of type of marks we can make. Now, down here, my intention was to show you kind of lighter on dark, but really dark on light, so I kind of messed that up. But anyway, we'll just maybe just kind of leave it at that. But you can do this with dark as well. So let's just go darker on here. Let's just use black, okay? So what I'm going to do, clean my brush off a little bit, take some black, put it down here. So let's add some water to it. You can see just how many lines I can create out of that just by applying it into that paint once, right? Or loading my brush. When I put paint into a brush, that's called loading it. And to do that, really I am putting my palm of my hand actually onto the surface of the table and gliding across. I'm using this to help regulate the amount of pressure and just holding that brush just the right level to that paper so that it stays consistently against it just the way I want it, to get just the tip on it, right? So again, I can do dry brushing on this. Let me get this in focus. So if I do dry brushing, wipe that brush off. Just want to really show you, it really doesn't matter what value or color you're using to make these marks. So you can see there I'm getting a dry brush effect. If you get too much paint on the brush, it won't do it. So you can't go far with it because there's not much paint on it to begin with. So you can maybe get 1, 2, or 3 marks out of it. Then you got to get more paint. So it's like you got to constantly keep putting a trace amount of paint onto the brush because you're not going to get very far with it. Okay? So here's your dry brush, and that's your paint with more water in it to thin it down. And this is, so you got these 2 different ways of working with the paint, okay? In terms of types of marks you're going to get. All right. So we're going to go over here, okay, and talk about texture, okay, in terms of what makes a good texture and what makes a bad texture, okay? So I'm going to use something like a dark gray on this. I'm going to go with this right here that we're just using. I'm actually going to use this kind of bigger brush, bigger round. I don't want like a really pointed thin brush at this point. I do want to try to use something that's a little thicker so that I'm going to make sort of a little like a dab type mark, okay? So do want kind of a dark value. That's good if this is kind of dry, I guess, but I might not have enough mixed to do everything I want to do. Okay. So I feel pretty good about that. Okay. So with this, a lot of times when students trying to make a texture, a lot of times they'll do kind of a row and columns kind of look. So they'll kind of do a row, and then they'll go up under that and do a mark right up under the other one, and just repeat the process. Right? So it's the same size brush mark, and then it's like in rows and columns, okay? And it just doesn't, it looks artificial, it looks man-made. It's just like, you can tell like when someone's planted trees, where the trees are growing in rows and columns. Whereas trees in nature, you know, they grow very, very varied, very sporadic and nuanced. So, so I'm going to repeat the same size mark, but now I'm going to vary the space on this and just kind of look at the difference. Even if I keep the same size mark, notice I'm going here, there, here, there. I'm trying to stay out of creating some kind of a pattern. Okay, so that in itself now feels much more natural versus that. Okay, that feels unnatural. That feels more natural. Now, imagine if I varied the spacing and the size. So I'm going to do some things that are kind of large. I'm going to do some things kind of small. maybe I'll kind of change the direction of the mark as well a little bit. Maybe change the pressure a little bit. So now that feels like it's really starting to come along. I think changing that direction too really kind of helped. Kind of give it more variety, whereas this one felt like it was everything was vertical, right? So I feel like that really helped with that. Now, imagine if I did that, but took it to the next level, okay? Right now, this still feels kind of flat, okay? And that's the thing about it is we want to give more dimension to it, and light and shadow will really kind of give more dimension, and stacking and layering. This feels like a mark is just sitting on the surface, right? It feels like a paint mark. But now, if I take this gray or something a little lighter than this gray and went back on top of it a little bit, and it would kind of create this more subtle kind of nuance in there to where I don't see any pattern evolve. Okay, so let me try to repeat that. I need more paint here. Let's see. So got quite a bit of paint on there. It's not really making my dry brush mark. There we go. All right, so now I'm going to take this gray that I had, and this will work. Now what this does, it reshapes this mark. Now this looks like something different than anything else that's there. So it's like I'm going back and editing and reshaping so that everything looks fairly unique and varied and different. So everything's now immersed. I see kind of like layers there. And with doing that, it just creates a lot more visual variety as if just looking at this. This just really looks kind of flat and 2D, whereas this all of a sudden has this other dimensional quality going on about it that looks much more varied. Okay, it looks dimensional. So stacking and layering is really important when you want to create something that looks like nature in terms of giving, because nature has depth, has dimension to it, whereas this just doesn't have that quality yet. So this actually gets you there. So you can keep doing this even if you wanted to. Usually when you paint foliage on trees anyway, you get that darker underbase and you create the lighter marks on top. Just because that's the way light and shadow kind of works, kind of nature. So if I got something kind of even lighter now, if I start to lose that underneath base, I may always go back with a little bit of that dark then to kind of punctuate back on top. So if I start to really lose that dark, then I'll selectively kind of go in with my dark. So there. I mean, try to sort that out. What mark I put down first, in terms of trying to figure out, it's so layered and the marks are so unique and different from each other, they're just little dabs. They really have a richness and variety that these just don't even come close to. Okay. All right. So coming over to the last thing we're going to do. All right. So this is all about edges. All right. So with edges, right now what we have is what's called a hard edge on all of these. Okay. That's a very crisp, defined edge. Okay. A lot of it has to do just simply because we got this light value against this dark value, and they just really create this hard edge. Okay. A lot of times that's kind of what's happening in clouds sometimes. You know, the top of the cloud gets really white and it gets really defined right there at the edge, where the, you know, blue sky actually is pretty dark. So it's represented as this value gray here for that blue sky. You can see how much that really stands out. But on the bottom edge of clouds, they tend to get darker in value because of just light and shadow. Just they're kind of pillowy and, you know, rounded, and so the edge starts to really blend in there, just simply due to um, the value being so similar, that it starts to really become lost right there. Okay. Still see a subtle maybe type edge right there, but it's very soft. Okay. So how do we create hard and soft edges? Because most of the time when we make marks, we're creating these sort of hard edges. You know, so how do we put this different value paint on top of another value? So how can we go back and when we're making our clouds, soften those edges when we're putting down our paint? So we can go back and we can do that. So one thing for a hard edge, there's a couple of things, you know, just right off the bat that you could do, but won't solve it necessarily. As you would think you could put a value in between. Here's what brush I should use. I think I'm going to use about this size brush for what I'm going to do now. So I'm going to try to mix something that's in between those values right there. So I'm trying to find something I can put down that won't, it'll be sort of in between those two. So just like that, okay, just even having another value in between those two starts to kind of create a new transition between those two values, right? Now another thing is also creating a rough edge. If I had this value or that value again, let's just see maybe if I could make that dark value again. It may not be exactly like it. But even if I have something that's kind of broken edge, kind of like that, can go a long ways. I'm just going to paint that in right there towards creating some kind of new transition between this area value and this area value. But those still have fairly hard edges to them, right? So, what can we do for a soft edge? Okay, so I'm going to try to do again with now, there's a couple of ways you can soften this edge, like make it smooth looking, okay? Just right now with this dry, it's going to be even more difficult. So there is a potential here where I could actually take a little bit of water. Like I said, tempera paint will re-wet. I could take a little bit of water, and I don't know how this is going to turn out. We'll just try it. So I'm going to take a little bit of water on my brush. It's not clean necessarily. And just go in between those two areas. And maybe that paint will start to re-wet some. Now it's still a little too dark right there. My brush had some kind of a dark value on it. So I'm going to see if I can get a little bit of light value here. And see, I'm sometimes taking my fingers, I know it's getting my fingers dirty, but I'll just kind of press it off like that just because I'm trying to get the paint off of it, trying to control what's on the brush. Okay, so now take a look at that. You know, I've created something, there's still a fairly observable edge there. But look how much softer it is. You know, it's really almost to the point of really being lost. It's just really kind of blurred. Okay. Now I did that by kind of re-wetting and then mixing basically another gray in between. Now this gray doesn't really match that one. You know, if I tried harder, maybe I could get that to kind of work out a little better. And maybe when it dries, it'll basically be that value. But you can start to see just how soft that is, okay? All right, so that's one way to do that, and I could continue that all the way across. I really like how that turned out. I could also really try to re-wet, like get this value over here if this is wet. Remember how I demonstrated this? Essentially, if this was wet, and then if I come back with the dark value, and if this dark value is wet, I really need to kind of clean my brush to do this. Now that those two areas are fairly wet, perhaps I can take my brush in between, essentially blend those together like that. Just wiping in between. So essentially I put down this is wet, this was wet, and then I kind of just brushed in between, and that created another value in between, sort of a transition, okay? So this one, these were dry, and I tried to add water to it to kind of reactivate them, which it did on some degree, but the dark was too much. I had to add a little bit of a light value to it. So that creates a soft, smooth edge. Now, how do we create a soft, rough edge? Now, we still see an edge there, okay? We still can pinpoint, okay, there's a value change within this area that, you know, is creating an edge. It's still fairly soft though, okay? But we still see an edge for the most part, okay? Okay, so for this one, we're going to try to create maybe this lighter value and do some dry brushing, okay, over into the lighter area. Hopefully it's working. So I'm just barely touching the papers because I don't want to press off too much paint. Okay. Now that created a softer edge. Look at it in comparison to what's next to it. Look how hard and crisp and defined that is. Like scissors cut it, right? Whereas now this has a, you know, it's not as smooth as that. Still see speckles, but you know, but there's a good, it softened the edge between this value and this one. I could even try to take some of this value and then maybe And that's the thing about dry brushing. You usually have to go in and edit it a little bit. Now I'm taking some of this darker value to kind of go in and push some of that back a little bit and dry brush over that. And it creates, again, some of this layering idea. You know, now I've got a light over a dark over a light, and I was able to edit that because dry brushing, you know, is pretty difficult in terms of controlling where the paint will come off and when it won't. And so if you go back with the other layers, then you can kind of edit that and then kind of hone it in to where you want it. Okay? All right, so the next one is Lost Smooth. Okay? Lost is different than soft because lost would mean that we just can't find an edge. Right here we still see a fairly distinct area of value change, right? So this is going to require us to do a couple of things. We're actually going to need to make another value in between that. That's just sort of what we're doing right there. See if this will work. Might actually be a little dark. So notice I'm covering up a lot of that part of that area. So I'm going to add a little bit of water to that because I could really use that. I'm just going to repeat that over in these areas because they're all lost as well. So as you can tell already, with a lost edge, there's a greater span between two values that come together. So there's going to be a bigger area of value change between those areas. Okay. All right. So with this one, I'm essentially going to attempt to do kind of what I was doing down here. Okay. So now I need to take my light value, put it back up here. It might have to repaint that whole area just to get it to match. And then I'm going to attempt to blend this in the best I can. And hopefully this gray is still wet enough to where I can do this. Now notice I'm using just small little touches. This isn't like a big back and forth kind of motion with a lot of paint. I see a lot of students goof up a bunch of paint and just sort of slop it on there. This, they're just small touches. I'm really not going to know what I get until, of course, until this dries. But right now you can really kind of almost see how that's becoming a lost edge. So I'm going to put a little more white up here. Come down this, maybe this is still wet. Towards then blending and mixing another value in between. Right? Maybe I want to lighten this area up a little bit more. So I'm just going to go pure white up there right now just because it's not getting the light enough to where I want it. And that's just too much paint. So I'll wipe that off. Small little marks, dabs really, just trying to get the paint to kind of mix in together with each other, okay? Okay, so now I'm going to try it in this area. So I can reactivate this gray a little bit. So I really need paint to be wet on the paper. Now these areas are dry. I really need them to be wet in order to do this. Okay. So now make something similar to that again if I can. I think that's what this is right here. See if I can get that to kind of mix in. Okay, that's all getting pretty dry right there. I'm going to try something. I'm going to wipe off my brush, add a little bit of water to it so I can get some of that water off. See if I can add just a little bit of moisture in there just for some of the brush. See if I can smooth some of that out. Alright. So it took a lot of work, and hopefully that's going to draw a lighter value right there. It's kind of an edge appearing right there. Here's a piece of poster board. So I'm starting to get my value back right there, but I do see a bit of an edge right there. Difficult thing is you gotta get value similar to what it is right there, and then just kind of go over the edge. The value like it, but maybe a little different. Again, what makes this difficult is the paint, looks different when it's wet versus when it's dry. Now some of this I am kind of basically doing sort of a dry brushing. Kind of scrub it in there. So that feels pretty good there. Maybe that'll darken a little bit more. So I kind of lost my dark value right there. I didn't mean to do that necessarily. Now this is getting really saturated on the paper pretty much. Kind of some moisture in there. So it really is blending now. And again, I'm just barely touching the paper. And you can see right here, there's just traces amount of paint coming off of this brush as I'm marking. Okay, just traces. It's basically like a dry brush. Okay, all right. So that was a lot of work. Whenever you're going to do a smooth lost edge gradient like that, like I was attempting over here, it is a lot of work because you're working back from one to another, back from one to another, changing the mixtures on your brush, whether it's wet or whether it's dry, or you got much paint or no paint, just to control it, to make that happen. That's a lot of work. So in there, we lost any edge whatsoever. I mean, it is like gone completely. Okay, we have no edges, none. They're lost. Okay, all right. So for this one, it's going to be a little different. What if we want to do something kind of like a speckle? You know, there's areas within this where there might be something like speckles, kind of like this, where we have value changes, but we don't have any edges in terms of where this dark is versus this light, right? So what do we do then? Well, we can do something with the speckle. So if I take something like this value, let's clean the brush off. Now with this one, I kind of will get kind of pointed with it. So I'm going to try to make something like this value again. Let's see. If I add a little bit of water to it. So I'll reactivate that value. This may not get pointed enough. Yeah, I'm going to switch over. Where's that other brush? Here's my really pointed brush. Okay, I'll use something a little finer point. So already I've kind of broken that edge right there a little bit. Brought some of this value down here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start spacing it out more. Okay. Now I'm going to take this value gray if I can find it. Then we'll work back over that a little bit and then come up in here a little bit. Again, this is almost like that stippling. I'm going to start spacing it out and then gather it closer as I get towards it. Okay, now notice that. The edge is gone. Lost, right? All because I took some of this value, brought it down here, spaced it out, and then took this value and brought it up here and spaced it out. Edge lost, okay? But there's a value change, a gradient. This is basically a gradient from one to another, okay? So now I'm going to continue with that gray. And let's come down here. I don't have enough mixed. So I'm going to have to mix on. So I'm trying to mix this gray. So I'm going on that edge, breaking it up, and then breaking a few very carefully calculated dots spaced out. Now I'll create that dark again. If I have it on my palette still wet. Hopefully this will be the same value, maybe it's a little darker. Add a little water to it because it's getting kind of thick on me. Okay, And now I'm going to go back over those a little bit and start to come up very calculated. Add more water. Keep my dots kind of small. Start to come up. To there. So there you go. Now I can keep going back with the different values to keep honing that in if I want to, but you can see basically that looks just as much of a gradient as over here, except done differently, right? Alright, so this is our last one. This is our lost edge. For our dashes, okay, this is again where you really are going to need to have paint fairly wet. So I still have this. I got my thin pointed brush, and now I'm going to make like little dashes. Keep adding a little bit of water just because it's so I can keep these kind of lines kind of. So I need to vary sort of the length and placement so that these don't become a pattern. Gotta be careful with that. Now I'm gonna go back with this gray value, if I can make it again. Add water. Kind of go back on top of those, kind of edit those a little bit. Then start to come down into my dark area. Okay, while I have it, go up into my light area. Space further apart when I get up into this light area. I have paint a little too dark. Group it closer together as I get down towards that edge. Now I'm going to take my light value. I'm going to try to wash this off. Wipe it off. Pretty good light value. Get pretty watery. Maybe edit back over some of these a little bit. And coming down into this gray area. The middle gray. I've heard, doing these kind of things, even when we were doing that, over here was kind of like stitching it together. You know, I was kind of just doing these little marks, kind of splotches, little dabs, just kind of get everything mixed together. And that's sort of what I'm doing here is, you think about it, it's kind of like almost stitching the two areas together. So now I have this really gradual gradient between the two, and I may have lost a little bit of my gray. So you can always go back and edit with their different values, okay? So in a way, this could be sort of like a water area. You know, ripples of water. You have a shadowy dark area, then you have a light area, and then they kind of, you know, the edges get lost and they blur, where this might be a tree shadow in the water, right? And this could be like a, you know, a tree. You know, how trees have sort of a shadow side and a light side. So, and this could be a sky or clouds or water. You know, so gradients are in doing that kind of lost edges are tricky, and be able to repeat that process. Okay, so this is the final demonstration before you get into actually doing some of your practice for your riverscape.